Let's bring in Dr. Mehmet Oz, host of the Dr. Oz Show. He's been joining us every day during the pandemic. Dr. Oz, it is terrific that the Comfort is now in the New York City area. Yesterday, they said it was 70,000 tons of I Love New York. But they're going to be serving people who don't have COVID. But here's the problem. It just takes one case of COVID-19 on that ship to potentially turn it into something that we've seen in cruise lines, doesn't it?
You're right, but they're pretty careful about this. I think, first of all, it's a great example of how the federal government can play a positive role from the vision of having a ship, Navy ship, come into port to help you out. It raises morale. And there are risks, no question, about some of COVID-19 coming in, but they're meticulously monitoring everybody. That's the whole point of separate facilities for COVID-19 patients and folks who have the ailment. And there's another hospital, the field hospital that's in Central Park, built by Samaritan's Purse, that's only taking COVID-19 patients. So we're pretty careful about this, and there are ways of screening it. As soon as any symptoms are demonstrated, at least that in that setting, you can rapidly change that. It's all a positive from my perspective. But the big issue is the testing. They have to test in that hospital, and the president spoke about this yesterday. We've done 1 million tests now in this country, but that's the solution that all of us need, because without that testing, you just don't know. So the commander of the Comfort doesn't know, that hospital director doesn't know, the governors don't know, and the president doesn't know if you don't test people adequately.
Yeah, Dr. Oz, it's funny you mentioned that, because the president yesterday in his press briefing, he pulled out one of those rapid tests that are being distributed starting today. Listen to what he said if you missed it at home.
Today we reached a historic milestone in our war against the coronavirus. Over 1 million Americans have now been tested, more than any other country by far, not even close, and tested accurately.
As the president mentioned today, the United States hit more than 1 million samples tested, a number that no other country has reached. We're now testing nearly 100,000 samples a day, also a level that no other country has reached.
Dr. Oz, I want you to respond to that. And also, we were talking, Brian mentioned the map of, you can see where the fevers are going down. Why is that if you have Dr. Fauci saying the peak is going to be in a week or two? What do we believe? Are we getting better? Are we going to see a peak in a week?
Well, I think both are true. The reality is the fever comes first. The person then sort of struggles for a couple days. Then they finally go to the hospital in New York City because there's no room. We'll do everything we can to keep you out of the hospital. When you finally get admitted a week or 10 days later, it shows up a statistic that the governor can show and say, hey, listen, here's the data on hospital admissions or even mortalities, which will lag even another week or two down the road. Because you don't go to the hospital and die. You go to the ICU from there, and then you get intubated. Then you struggle. Then you, God forbid, you die. So the numbers all make perfect sense. I think Brian maybe could be an epidemiologist going forward, because he's right. What we're seeing now is a slow decline of the rise that we were seeing. So no longer are we doubling numbers of people going to the hospital every 2 days. Now it's every 6 days. And that should peak based on the Chinese data over the next 2 weeks. But of all the numbers we follow, the most important number is what the president just said, 1 million tests done. That number means we can finally decide in a targeted way exactly what we're going to do. We can take sniper shots at problems rather than having to blast everything with a shotgun. That gives us so much more opportunity to correct the problems we're facing.
Yeah, that box. We got to get that box out so we get a quick results on these tests and you don't need the reagents. So let's talk about immunity. How do we build immunity in our system to kill the virus early? What could you tell us about examples of progress there? Treatment.
So I'll go through this list. There's going to be four different categories. I'm going to leave immunizations to the side, although I'm very happy that Johnson & Johnson got a big government contract to really scale this up. We have a bunch of companies doing this. God bless them all. They all work in slightly different ways, and I'm very confident that some of these will pan out for next year. But what do we do in the meantime? So here's 4 different categories. The first thing is you build up your innate immune system. And there's a couple ways of doing it, and I've got some lists. You'll put them up on the screen. The first item that I'm going to point out, and this is critical, is that you can enhance the immune system with convalescent plasma therapy, which is you give immunoglobulins, antibodies made by someone who recovered into someone who's deathly ill. And that seems to jumpstart them. There was a nice article in JAMA, one of our biggest medical journals, showing 4 out of 5 patients did really well with this program. 4 or 5 people who are, these people are all dying, basically, and the 5th person is still alive. That's good news. And interestingly, high-dose vitamin C might play a role here. which is one of the reasons we think vitamin C helps to shorten the duration of a common cold. So it's probably worth considering in high doses in New York hospitals and other facilities are testing it, but the jury's still out. By the way, I'm going to go through this list. It's all going to be on foxnews.com, and I'll put it on my social media feeds as well. There's a lot more. There's 100 different ideas out there that are being tried. Next up, you want to prevent the virus. If your immune system's not strong enough, you don't want the virus to get into the cell. So how do you block it from getting into the cell? Well, that's where hydroxychloroquine plays a role. We've been talking about it a lot. That's the malaria drug. We believe that's one of the mechanisms by which it might play a role. I actually corresponded with Didier Raoult, the physician leading the trials in France. You know, they're going to have 500 patients on these combination with azithromycin, the Z-Pak, this week. And if he could, he'd add zinc, because he believes high-dose zinc, which could potentiate the action, and that's something you can do at home, frankly. You take a low dose now if you desire, but we don't have evidence of that. But high dose, if you get ill, might make sense. The third major area is if the virus, if your immune system can't catch it and it penetrates into your cells, well, then the question is, how do you block its replication? How do you stop it from doing damage? There's remdesivir is a good example. Lopenar, Ridovir. These are promising therapies. Some of them have not shown efficacy to the degree we've desired, but these were designed for other illnesses like HIV and Ebola, and now they're being utilized in a more aggressive fashion in these different trials, because in theory they should work. And finally, you can block the over-response of our inflammatory system, the complement storm, so to speak, where the body just can't keep up with the virus. And there are two medications I put on here, which are both still experimental, but there's a bunch of others that work in this area. And remember, if we have a drug that works for people who have horrible infections or bad cancers to block the over-response of the body, well, you could use those same drugs for coronavirus, for COVID-19. So that's our hope. And one last idea that I quickly went by, losartan, which is a medication, it's a blood pressure medication. It works at the same receptor that this virus uses to sneak into your cells. Jury's still out. We don't want people going off those meds, because it turns out they may actually help you by blocking the virus from getting in. So those trials, again, FDA-approved products, we'll have to show that they work, but that might be an opportunity as well.
Sure. So, Dr. Oz, the medical community is looking at all these various drugs, and I know they use some supercomputers to try to figure out what drugs might work with this particular version of COVID-19. But let's say somebody's watching right now in Detroit, and they've got COVID, they've been tested, and they've got it. Does every doctor in America right now know these various drugs that could potentially help their patient?
No, categorically not. The one drug that's gotten mind share of the physician community, and I know this because I've spoken to so many doctors in so many states, is the chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, especially when combined with azithromycin. And part of that's because it's been elevated to a conversation point by discussions of our public officials, and the medical community respects that they're probably safe enough that we're not doing any harm. And as the governor of Kansas told me recently, he said, you go to war with the army you have, and this is all we have right now. But some of these other products have been used clinically in other settings. As I mentioned, the losartan family of drugs, the blood pressure drugs. And those drugs, therefore, could be rapidly transitioned over because doctors know how to use them. They know how to use them safely. If there's any clue they may be beneficial in the right patient, we'll start to experiment. But what Dr. Fauci said is right. You want to simultaneously test these. And when the president insisted that there be clinical testing, in the meantime, pushed the FDA to approve these products for doctors to prescribe, that was the right move. You know, trust that they might work, verify that they work with clinical trials. In the meantime, don't hold doctors back, I should say. Don't tie the hands of doctors from doing the most for their patients. If you're a patient and you get COVID-19, it is worth asking your doctor about any of the products on this list, especially the hydroxychloroquine. We don't know for sure. But if the chloroquine is effective, you might try it.
All right, Dr. Oz, Brian was interviewing a girl in her 20s who had it, and she was so frustrated. She called the hotline, waited an hour and 45 minutes. Then they told her they'd call her back with the test, and then she called again. She was on hold for a while, and then they said, you need to call your physician and get a test. She called her physician, and he said, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. I know we're all figuring this out right now, and there are a lot of unknowns, but when will we be at a point as a country where we have all the drugs we need, we have all the masks that we need, we have all the supplies for the hospital, we have the ventilators? When will we get to that point?
Well, you were kind enough to ask my question of the president yesterday, because it's all driven by testing. And I'll give you an example why that's so important. Right now, if I order a test, and this is true all over the country, I can probably wait 5-6 days to get the result back. Now, imagine going to a hospital as a patient. You're not sure, you had a fever and a cough, you feel tired. Classic signs, but you don't know what that means. You get admitted, they order the test. For 5 to 7 days, you stay in an isolation room with all the nurses wasting caps, gowns, masks, because it turns out you didn't have COVID-19, because most of the time the test comes back negative. Now, all those resources thrown away because we didn't have a test. Likewise, our ability to target people and make sure the right ones are given priority to get to the ICU or get intubated is wasted when we don't know for sure what we're dealing with. So once we have the testing, all the other opportunities become augmented because we'll use our resources more efficiently. And the ventilator, I do believe that by the middle of April, we'll have GM and other companies making enough that that problem goes away.
I hope so. You have talked more than anybody else about hydroxychloroquine, and you want to get the results of this study. So is one way to get the results of this study, if I can say this effectively, is the people that are on it now for whatever it's lupus or whatever everything else, can you find out how this virus is acting in them and quickly get their record from Medicare and Medicaid because it's paid for by them and see how it's acting, get the results of that study, and see if it could be mass-produced from coast to coast?
You know, that is such a brilliant idea. The Chinese actually did it. Well, the reason they began using this drug as part of their routine in China is they looked at a hospital that had a very big volume of cases. And it turns out that none of the patients who were on the chloroquine for their lupus or their rheumatoid arthritis, which is the reason you'd be on it, got COVID-19. And conversely, none of the patients who got COVID-19 had rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. So then they thought, well, what's the difference? Well, there are a couple differences, obviously, but one of them was this medication use. And that was one of the key clues that got them moving forward on making this part of their formulary, so to speak. I think that is a wonderful concept. The FDA, actually, CMS, Seema Verma could do this immediately, rapidly check to see if, in fact, it's having a protective effect. That would give, I think, a lot of the medical community comfort that they weren't overstretching by reacting to a bunch of case reports and large groups of patients being with their data collected as opposed to a traditional randomized trial that we're more comfortable acting on.
So get Seema Verma to do it. You'll be okay with that.
Thank you very much for giving us an update on things that are going on the cutting edge of medicine right now, because there are patients in the states of Louisiana and Michigan and New Jersey. And it looks like those are the states that are going to be impacted next. Sir, we thank you very much for joining us live.